The Heart. Miranda went into the trees at the top of the ridge behind the cabin and came out at the edge of the shallow gorge that cut through the island. Some dozen feet below the tree line, the gray and white striated rock curved above an emerald inlet where tufts of sweet flag and purple-blooming spiderwort grew along the water's edge. She saw the boy's trail in the dirt, wide, loping tracks where he had crossed the gorge and gone up into the trees. She picked her way across and stood at the top of the ridge to catch her breath. Below, the inlet widened around a bend to collect in a clear, deep cistern enclosed by a wall of limestone. Here, when he was 6 and she 17, she had taught the boy to swim. Nature had gifted him the webs, the scales. All he'd lacked was the courage to dive in, and Miranda had seen to that, standing in the shoulder-deep water with her arms open. I will catch you, I will keep you, I will never let you go. Knowing, of course, one day he would stray too far from Isker's Island, maybe chance across a hunter and his son, or a bootlegger at his still, or even some lost, turned-out congregant from Sabbath House living off the land. For though the old woman's island was a secret place, a hidden pocket in the lining of the world, its borders were easily crossed. And what then, she wondered? Would they see a boy, a monster? Would they raise a hand or a gun? She set off into the woods, where she made only a half-hearted search for the boy's sign. She knew his habits, his trails. He would go to the black oak at the center of the meadow. Miranda walked quietly, enjoying the woods, which were gloomy with the day's long light. High up and far away, a whippoorwill gave out its lonesome call. After a while, she came out of the trees into a field of knee-high grass where butterflies were having the last pink blooms of summer's fleabane. At the center of the clearing, the black oak, a gnarled giant with wide, low-hanging limbs. She scanned the other trees at the edge of the clearing, for the boy didn't see him. Movement in the oak caught her eye. Hanging by his ankles from the lowest branch was a man, the grass stained red beneath him. The meadow rippled in a soft, warm breeze. The body spun gently at the end of the rope, and Miranda saw the face of her father, Miranda Crabtree. She felt a falling away inside her, like a shelf of rock collapsing. The boatman wore the same shirt, jeans, and boots he had worn the last night she had seen him alive, thighs and knees mud-spattered. His arms hung straight down, a slit beneath his jaw like a frown, his face otherwise expressionless, save the empty, stupid gaze of the dead. An arrow protruded from his chest just above the heart, fletching the same light gray of the arrows Miranda carried even now in her quiver. No, she said, or thought she said, unaware that her fingers, despite her bow in one hand, were moving in sign, the way she had taught little fish to speak. She forgot to breathe. She grew light-headed and sat down in the grass. The sun, low behind the oak, lit Hiram's corpse in a nimbus of gold. Little fish, suddenly, in silhouette above her. Miranda stared up at him blankly. The boy was bending down, setting his bow on the ground. "You okay?" he signed. She gripped his arm and pointed over his shoulder at the tree. "Man," she managed to sign, hands quaking. "See?" Little Fish glanced over his shoulder. "Man," he signed, then shook his head. "Doe." "Doe." She looked up. It was a deer. The boy had shot an arrow through its heart and slid a rope through the tendons of its legs to haul it up and cut its throat. Even now it bled out on the bright green grass. Miranda pushed up slowly from the ground. Her legs shook. "I don't," she said, but that was all she said. Curious, worried, Little Fish watched her. She forced a dry-throated laugh in defiance of the hot tears that sprang into her eyes and shook her head. She went to the doe where it hung. She touched the arrow that had felted its shaft, buried in the chest. Miranda looked around, saw the story of his kill. He had climbed the oak and waited, and the doe had wandered into the long grass to graze. The boy had taken her with a shot that was easily 50 or 60 yards. She saw the depression in the grass, the blood trail where he had dragged her from the tree line to the oak at the center of the meadow. Miranda marveled at the distance, the precision. The boy was pure instinct. She, a gap shooter, judged her elevation by the space between the tip of her arrow at full draw and her target. Every shot Miranda made was a calculation, whereas the boy's were riddles. She ran one hand along the flank of the deer, its fur stiff like the bristles of a paintbrush. "Good shot," she said. He broke into a smile, and his smile was brilliant and warm. Instantly, she felt better. "You shouldn't leave it in, though." She gripped the arrow lodged in the doe's breast and tore it free. The broadhead was a razor, one of a set she had given him for his birthday last spring. "Show me how it's done," she signed. The sky bled vermilion as the boy drew a skinning knife from his belt of squirrel and rabbit pelts and began the work of dressing. When he hesitated, she took his hand and guided the blade to the groin. He put the knife into the deer, cut down through the rib cage, and slowly the deer came open. Little Fish buried his arms to the elbows inside the animal. Out came the viscera. He dropped it in a heap, plunged back in. Miranda watched him. He was beautiful. Her love for him frightened her. "Baba says you're not sleeping," she said. "Want to talk about it?" He shook his head. The deer gave a squelch as he drew his arms out. "Why not?" "No words," he signed, hands bloody. "Make them?" The boy hesitated, then stuck his knife in the dead animal's flank. He brought his hands together and worked his fingers without looking at Miranda, as if talking to himself. Flies buzzed around and crawled on the animal's hide. She caught the words red, fire, and afraid. Finally, he threw his hands apart, let his long arms fall at his side, and just shook his head. Then went back to the deer, working behind the sternum at something stubborn. And when he took his hands out, his arms red, Miranda saw that he was holding something small and round, a perfect arrow-shaped wound in its center. Smiling, he held it out to her. It was the heart. Happy birthday, Sadie.